Pozdravljeni. Mislim, da bom takoj presedljal na angleščino. Bo lažje, pravzaprav, kot da dvakrat prevajam. Tako da, welcome to today's lecture. I'm honored to introduce to you Professor Franck Fishbach. He will have a lecture titled The Difficulties of Critical Theory with the City. Professor Fischbach is a professor of history of modern German philosophy at Pantheon-Sorbonne University and a research fellow at the Center for the History of Modern Philosophy at the Sorbonne. He has written numerous books and articles on the topics ranging from Hegel, social philosophy, to deprivation of the world, and even cinema. But just to highlight two books that were translated into Slovene by the publishing house Cartina. One is Without Subject, Capitalism, Subjectivity, and Alienation, and the other one is What is Socialist Government, What is Alive, and What is Dead in Socialism. Today's lecture will have a special format. First, we will have a lecture by Professor Fischbach, and it will be followed by an intervention by Dr. Martin Hergouth, who will offer, I think, a sort of a critical reflection of the lecture, and then we can open up the floor to a wider debate. And one last thing, one important thing, today's lecture is organized as a part of Hegel's political metaphysics project, and the lecture itself is co-organized by the Faculty of Arts, Goethe-Institute of Ljubljana, and Modern Gallery, and I thank all three of them. So I don't want to take any more time for the introduction, so the floor is yours, Professor Fischbach.
Thank you very much for the presentation, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure for me to be here and to have the opportunity to present this lecture about some difficulties of critical theory with the city or the town. It is a fact that the city, urban life, and the historical process of urbanization, which are central to modernity, are not privileged objects in the tradition of critical social theory. And it is so much the case that the city could almost be used as a criterion for distinguishing between social criticism and the criticism of culture, what the Germans call the Kulturkritik, just as many representatives of the latter have offered illuminating analyses of the modern city and urban life, starting with Georg Simmel, so the representatives of social criticism seems to have neglected these questions. Here we would like to ask why this is the case, and what are the sources and causes of this relative indifference and ambivalent attitude of critical theorists toward the city, the town, and the urban question in general. We will start by giving some examples of this ambivalence and or indifference, and then look for the causes and the origins of it in Marx and Engels. This ambiguity of critical theory with regard to the city can be found, for example, in Benjamin. In relation to Baudelaire, he points out that the formation of crowds in large cities is experienced by the poet as a condition of possibility for a completely new urban and modern poetry. But there is also, Benjamin adds, at the heart of the Flannery, an anguished phantasmagoria, as the poem The Seven Old Men shows. An old man in yellow rags suddenly appears in front of the stroller, who is immediately followed by his equal, who is in turn followed by his twin, and so on until 7. In the crowd, the same individual seems to be multiplied in such a way that he is no longer worthwhile as an individual, but as the incarnation of a type. It is then that the city, so said Benjamin, the city dweller experiences the anguish of no longer being able to break the magic circle of the type, in spite of the implementation of the most eccentric singularities. This goes hand in hand with the fact that these same individuals, precisely because they are examples of the same type, appear to be subject to automatisms. It is the same kind of behavior that is infinitely reproduced by these individuals, who are only examples of the same types, indefinitely reproduced. And it is then that the positive experience of the flâneur, the solitary walker in the crowd of the big city, is reversed into its opposite. It becomes that of the irremediable distress of the solitary in the midst of the crowds. The crowds of the big city then become an hostile environment in which the walker has an experience to which Benjamin attaches considerable importance, the experience of shock. Shock appears to Benjamin as the preponderant form of sensation, further accentuated by the objectified and capitalist process of labor. So said Benjamin. Benjamin can thus write that the process which determines the rhythm of production on the factory line is at the very basis of the mode of reception specific to film spectators. And this set of mechanical reflexes which the machine brings into play in the worker by a chain of successive shocks is exactly the same as that which is also brought into play in the film spectator, in the gambler and in the worker in the streets of large cities. The shock and the mechanical reaction to the reflex type that immediately follows it synthesize for Benjamin the meaning of the experience of the large industrial city insofar as it is a place of an unfolding of empty time that has no other content than the successive shocks that continuously punctuate it. This reveals what Benjamin calls the authentic face of the big city. It is an anguished figure in which what Baudelaire still called the pleasure of being in crowds is completely extinguished. The paradigms of critical theory that Horkheimer and Adorno used obviously did not allow them to really take the city as a specific object of study. It is as if the distrust of the two founders of the Frankfurt Institute towards American pragmatism has been extended to the pragmatist sociology of the Chicago School, which had made the city and urban life the favorite objects of its studies and investigations. Horkheimer and Adorno did address the themes related to the city, the masses, the media, propaganda and advertising, etc., but they never took the city itself directly as an object. As far as Adorno is concerned, we can look at a brief autobiographical text published in 1966, dedicated to Amorbach, the small town where he grew up in Franconia, 80 kilometers from Frankfurt, to find one of the rare evocations of the big city in his work. The later, the big city, which Adorno only really knew in Paris and then, above all, in New York, appears to him to be subject of the process of standardization, itself a product of technology and monopoly. The big city is a place, Adorno notes, where one comes to think that qualitative differences have really disappeared from life, just as the progress of rationality excludes them from method. The experience of the big city is thus that distressing, according to Adorno, of the uniformization that makes all places similar by subjecting them all equally to the process of real abstraction that is the world of commodities and the rule of value. In contrast, the small town is a place of an experience of happiness, so says Adorno, which is that of what Adorno calls the unchangeable, the exact opposite of the universal exchange which reigns in the big city and marks it with its standardizing stamp. Even if we are to discover later that the small town of childhood is not as unique as we thought, or that it has also been subject to standardizing processes that go back further than the industrial era, the fact remains that it will have been the seat of an experience of the unique and the non-exchangeable that is excluded from the big city. These insights offered by Adorno are certainly stimulating, but it must be said that they remain marginal in his work, and the impression remains that the big city is little more for him than the seat of processes that interest him much more, such as the standardization of life produced by the cultural industry. As for Habermas, also the question of the city and urbanism does not occupy a considerable place in his work. He is one of the few representatives of critical theory who attempted to approach the city from his own theoretical framework and critical paradigm. The most significant insights can be found in his 1981 article, Modern and Postmodern Architecture. In this text, Habermas is very critical of the representatives of postmodernism, but this does not prevent him from also being very aware of the difficulties and apories of modernism. Such an awareness is in fact indispensable for the realization of Habermas' project of a self-critical pursuit of modernity. This implies a clarification of the difficulties that the modern project has encountered so far in the field of the city and architecture. In these areas, the modern movement has certainly been able to become aware of the challenges posed by qualitatively new needs and new technical possibilities, and from this point of view, it has been able to provide a correct response, so said Habermas. However, this same modern movement was rather disarmed when it came to confronting the systematic constraints exerted by the imperative of the market and of administrating planning. From this point of view, what the modern movement lacked was a clear awareness, or at least a sufficient awareness, of the contradictions that characterize capitalist modernization, and in particular of the contradiction between, on the one hand, the needs that prompt the shaping of the life, of the world of life, and on the other hand, the imperatives communicated through the media of money and power, through the two systems that in capitalist modernity tend, according to Habermas, to colonize the world of life. The limit of the modern project thus lies in its very diagnosis of what the city has become in the course of the capitalist modernization of societies. The city has ceased to be what Habermas calls a transparent world of life. As long as this was the case, it was still possible to give the functions of the city an architectural form, because these functions were themselves still integrated into the world of life. Thus, political and economic functions, private and public functions, cultural and religious functions, functions related to work, living, leisure, or festivals could, as Habermas puts it, be translated into purpose, into functions governing the use of shaped spaces. But the entry into the second age of capitalism in the 20th century made such a translation impossible. The city, writes Habermas, has become the crossroads of functional links of another kind, which are characterized by their abstraction, anonymity, invisibility, and unavailability to actors. The city of the 20th century is a city involved in abstract systems which escape any attempt to give them a sensitive presence of an aesthetic order. The translation of the language of systems into that of the world of life proves to be impossible. These languages are incommensurable, incompatible with each other. And the whole of systems on urban life is now such that it leads Habermas to ask whether the concept of the city itself is not outdated. This is because our concept of the city has remained associated with a certain form of life, and therefore with a form of the world of life which has been so transformed and disrupted by the hold of the systems that this concept no longer has much to do with reality. Having made this critical diagnosis, it remains to be seen whether the critical theorist is capable, if not of offering resources to the actor and opening up perspectives for their action, then at least of identifying resources in the actions actually carried out and in social reality that could remedy the dysfunctions caused by the hold of the systems on the urban world of life. From this point of view, the critical theorist's attention is drawn to initiatives to promote communal architecture that involve the interested parties in the planning process and that draw up neighborhoods plans in dialogue with the inhabitants, so said Habermas. In the world of life itself, therefore, strategies are put in place which Habermas admits are defensive in nature, but which have the merit of being based on the living experience of those concerned of the dysfunctions generated in their world of life by the regulatory mechanism of the market and of the administrations, and which have the effect of invalidating the functionalism originally intended. The way out, as Habermas sees it, would be to put in competition with the media of money and power the communications through which the interested parties form a collective will. To put it in other terms, and in this case, borrowing from Murray Bookchin's opposition between urbanization and citizenships, we can say that Habermas' proposal consists of systematically favoring, reinforcing, and consolidating in the urban form of life the communicative practices that are part of a citizenship rooted in the world of life, as opposed to an urbanization generated by the systems of economy and administration of money and power. Also, it may seem rather limited and perhaps a little too modest, Habermas does attempt to make his critical paradigm useful not only for a critical understanding of development in the city, but also for the formulation of ways of counteracting the properly pathological effects of the colonization of the urban world of life by the functional imperatives of systems. This is why it is all the more surprising that the more recent representatives of critical theory have left the critical potential of their theoretical paradigm for an understanding of contemporary urban life and its own pathologies virtually unexplored and untapped. This is particularly the case with Axel Honneth, whose analyses of the city are hard to find. This is all the more regrettable because his critical paradigm, that of the struggle for recognition, certainly has resources within itself that allow us to think critically about urban forms of life and the process of urbanization. For example, it would be possible to focus on the way in which urban space is a space woven with signs of recognition, or rather, signs of non-recognition and denial of recognition, which are addressed to specific populations. Some contemporary transformations of urban space could thus be interpreted as wrongs and injustices done to certain categories of the population. This is particularly the case of recent forms of urban furniture, as demonstrated by Michael Labi in this book. This is particularly the case of recent forms of urban furniture that are designed to prevent their use by the homeless. The construction of walls around the hot air extraction events in car parks or metro stations are also ways of signaling to the homeless that they are not welcome in the urban space, just as metal spikes on the curbs or on elements of street furniture are signs addressed to young people who might be tempted to use them as elements for an improvised skate park. These considerations may seem like microsociology, but I am convinced that there is a possibility to do more and to link, for example, the description of this concrete things of denial of recognition in contemporary urban space with the program of an analysis of the paradoxes of capitalism engendered by the end of the social democratic era and the entry into that of the neoliberal revolution. In particular, one could make the link between these conspicuous signs of social contempt addressed to the excluded and marginalized, and the idea that in networked capitalism, said Honneth, citizens tend more and more to perceive their performances, successes, and failures in an individual way, so that any reference to a larger whole hardly seems possible anymore. In this sense, it would be this individualization of failures, and even more so the excessive responsibility of individuals for their failures or lack of performance, that would explain why it is now possible to display and disseminate clearly and ostensibly in the urban space manifest signs of social contempt for those who have precisely failed and who are required to bear the responsibility alone. If we look at the critical paradigm proposed more recently by Hartmut Rosa, that of acceleration in the context of a social critique of time, we are also struck by the underutilization of this paradigm in the context of an approach of the city, urban life and space. By reinterpreting the process of modernization as essentially a process of social acceleration, one might have expected that the process of urbanization would not only be thematized, but would even play a key role. However, it is not the case. Hartmut Rosa only mentions the city and urban life at the beginning of his of his book, mainly to give Simmel credit for establishing the link between urbanization and acceleration, but without taking this link as an explicit theme and without further elaborating it. Hartmut Rosa refers to the big city and the life of the mind, on the influence of Monet in the rhythm of life, or the last chapter of the philosophy of Monet, and recognizes the specificity of Simmel's contribution to the understanding of the process of social modernization. Where other classics of sociology, Weber and Durkheim, to name but a few, have interpreted modernization as rationalization, functional differentiation, and individualization, Simmel, on the other hand, puts more emphasis on the fact that modernization is a process of transformation of the structure of the personality. Modernization, writes Rosa, means for Simmel, above all, a metamorphosis of the personality structure of individuals who react to the excessive demands placed on them by the acceleration of modernity, by transformation of their affective economy, their mental structure, their nervous life, and the relationship between emotion and intellect. But the fact that this transformation of the personality of individual does not take place anywhere, and that it takes place or nowhere, and that it takes place concretely on the floor of the big city, is not explored either by Rosa, who prefers to emphasize monetary exchange as what in the final analysis would explain both the acceleration of social relation and their intellectualization. However, monetary exchange is not the ultimate element of explanation, or at least not the only one, insofar as its generalization did not take place out of the ground. It required a favorable and propitious terrain, which consisted precisely in the formation of the large modern city. It seems that Hartmut Rosa takes more account of this correlation, and especially of its location, the city, in his more recent Resonance, a sociology of the relationship to the world, referring again to the same text by Simmel, The Great City and the Life of Mind. Rosa notes that, I quote, in the space of the big city, the high density of interactions and the frequency of physical encounters are such that they force subjects to discard a certain mode of dispositional resonance in order to adopt in their relationships an attitude that is half indifferent, half repulsive. In other words, the subjects of the late modernity lose the word as a speaking and responding vis-à-vis as they expand their instrumental access to it. This loss of the word is itself due to the fact that the subjects of late modernity are structurally forced to see the word as capital to be invested in competitive struggle. In other words, to adopt a reifying perspective. But if, like Hartmut Rosa, we recognize that the big city and modern urban life are the seats of this loss of a resonant relation to the world, of this reification of the world and of individuals themselves, then we should also set ourselves the task of determining what transformations should be introduced into the city and urban life that would allow us to re-establish a resonant type of relation to the world. However, this precise and determined task seems to be dissolved in a much broader program, which is the interruption of the logic of growth typical of late capitalist society, the transition to a post-growth society, and a replacement of the blind machine of capitalist exploitation by democratic economic institutions, so says Rosa. Here we find the same tendency, already noted in Habermas, to approach the problem of the big city from a much broader framework, which is known other than that of an analysis of the capitalist mode of production as a whole and the metabolic crisis that it provokes in the relationships to nature and the world. This tendency, which seems to be quite general among critical theorists, does not come from nowhere. It originates with Marx and Engels, to whom we must also trace the ambivalent attitude towards the urban phenomenon that we have seen, for example, in Benjamin. This ambiguity in the discourse on the big city is in fact evident from the situation of the working class in England. On the one hand, Engels cannot hide his admiration for the technical technical and industrial exploits made possible in and by the modern big city. He writes in particular, I quote, "A city like London, where you can walk for hours without even reaching the beginning of the end, without discovering the slightest hint that the countryside is near, is really something very special. This enormous centralization, this cramming of 4 million human beings into one place has increased the power of those 4 million men 100-fold. It has raised London to the status of the commercial capital of the world, created the gigantic docks and gathered the thousands of ships which continuously cover the Thames. I know of nothing more imposing than the sight of the Thames as you go up the river from the sea to London Bridge. It is all so grand, so enormous, that you are stunned and amazed at the greatness of England before you set foot on her soil." End of the quote. But Engels, the same Engels, in the immediate aftermath of the same text, cannot conceal his deep disgust with the great city whose exploits and miracles he has just admired. Here is what he writes, I quote again, "As for the sacrifice that all this has cost, we only discover them later. When one has beaten the pavement of the main streets for a few days, when one has painfully made one's way through the rabble, the endless lines of carriages and carts, when one has visited the bad parts of this metropolis, it is only then that one begins to notice that these Londoners have had to sacrifice the best part of their quality as human beings to accomplish all the miracles of civilization with which the city abounds. There is something repulsive in the rush of the streets alone, which revolts human nature. It is never occurs to anyone to give another person even a glance. This brutal indifference, this insensitive isolation of each individual within his particular interests is all the more repugnant and hurtful the greater the number of these individuals confined in this reduced place. An ambiguity, not to say a contradiction, of the same kind can be found again in Engels' 1887 text, The Housing Question. Here again, he alternates between celebrating the achievements of the modern industrial city and rejecting it, this time going so far as to formulate the project of abolishing the big cities, I quote. In this text, Engels refused to join the whining of the German Proudhonian Arthur Mühlberger, and instead wants to see as progress the expulsion of the workers from their homes. He credits the great modern industry with having made the workers rift to the ground, a proletarian possessing absolutely nothing, since this is a condition for the abolition of the cities. This is a condition for the formation of a truly revolutionary class. Not having a home is, according to Engels, I quote, the very first condition of the moral emancipation of the workers. There can therefore be no nostalgia for the pre-industrial era in which workers were attached to their rural homes, since, in his own words, only the proletariat created by modern large-scale industry, freed from all the chains of the past, including those which tied it to the soil and consecrated in the big cities, is in a position to accomplish the great social transformation which will put an end to all exploitation and class domination. End of the quote. On this line of thought, we are far from a critique of the modern city and urban life. On the contrary, we are close as possible to their apology because of the decisive contribution they make to the concentration and formation of the revolutionary working class. But there is also another line of thought in Engels, which emerges when he considers the solution to the housing crisis proposed by both the Proudhonians and the bourgeois economists. This solution consists of making the workers of large-scale industry, and therefore of the cities, owners of their own homes. This amounts to saying that the solution is the one offered by the cottage system. That is to say, the system in which each working class family has its own little house with, if possible, a small garden. The difficulty is that such a solution is not practicable in the very place where the problem is supposed to be solved, namely in the cities. Alas, 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 exclaimed Engels, the cottage system is impracticable precisely in the centers where the crisis of high land prices is rife in the cities. The alleged solution to the urban housing crisis therefore consists in housing the workers precisely where they do not live, in the countryside, where they would be offered cottages with gardens. This leads Engels to say that the bourgeois solution of the housing question has gone bankrupt. It has come up against the opposition between town and land. Here we are, he had Engels at the very heart of the question. And it is an understatement to say so, because this is where we come up against a major problem posed by the thought of Marx and Engels and transmitted to the tradition of critical theory. The problem of the suppression of the opposition between town and countryside or land. And its corollary, the suppression of large towns. The question is what such an abolition of the opposition between town and land might consist of. The whole problem is there, made even more acute by the fact that the abolition of this opposition amounts in reality to the abolition of the great modern cities. The great modern cities, Engels clearly writes, will only be abolished by the abolition of the capitalist mode of production. Does the abolition of the town-land separation mean a definitive victory of the town, of the city, of the countryside? And should it consist of a generalization of urbanization so that all can benefit from the advantages of the town? But if this is what's all about, how is it a revolutionary reversal? The development of capitalism has been taking care of the urbanization process for 200 years, and there is no guarantee that the continuation of this process, let alone its radicalization and amplification, is synonymous with a break with capitalism. In short, what can the abolition of the city and the countrysides mean for authors who, on the other hand, glorify urban life by considering it as a place where material conditions accumulate, which are the same times those of a break with the capitalist society? To find a solution, let's start again with the idea that the opposition between town and countryside is pushed to the extreme by capitalist society. as Engels said. Marx's diagnosis, especially in Book 3 of Capital, seems to be becoming more precise, if only because he is no longer content to speak abstractly of the city and the countryside or the land. The countryside, in particular, is now understood by Marx as the theater of confrontation between two forms of property, small versus large landed property. Small landed property is in fact already condemned by the progress of industrial agriculture, whose form of private property is that of large landed property. It is this form of agriculture that is on the rise, which reduces said Marx, which reduces the agricultural population to a minimum, to a figure that is constantly falling in the face of an industrial population concentrated in the large cities and which is constantly increasing. In other words, the development of large landed property is a consequence of industrialization, and the latter is a process which affects the countryside and agriculture as much as the city, or as Marx puts it, large-scale industry and large-scale industrially exploited agriculture act in the same direction. It seems, therefore, that the development of capitalist societies is the opposite of an opposition between town and country. On the contrary, it seems now to be a submission of both countryside and town to processes of the same nature and which produce similar consequences in both. Large land holdings and industrial agriculture create, Marx notes, conditions which cause an irremediable hiatus in the complex equilibrium of the social metabolism composed by the natural law of life. The result is a waste of the forces of the soil, a waste which trade transfers far beyond the country under consideration. End of the quote. If there is a separation and opposition here, it is no longer between the city and the countryside. The separation, or hiatus, is now between the rule of industrial society, encompassing city and countryside on the one hand, and nature or the earth, as Marx said, on the other. This is the hiatus in which the metabolic equilibrium between society and nature is disrupted, and thus the crisis of the metabolism between society and nature is triggered. The further development of the social force of production, both industrial and agricultural, is henceforth carried out by wasting the forces of the soil and destroying the natural conditions of all social and historical existence. It can no longer even be said that the difference between large-scale industry and large-scale agriculture consists in the fact that the former, as Marx said, the former ravages and ruins more the labor power and thus the natural power of mankind, while the later ravages and ruins more directly the natural power of the earth. End of the quote. In reality, the great industry of the cities and the great industrial agriculture of the countryside are now lending a hand to each other. The latter accomplishes in the countryside what the former does in the cities and vice versa. The industrial system, said Marx, in the countryside also ends up debilitating the workers, he said, while industry and commerce, for their part, provide agriculture with the means of exhausting the earth. The abolition of the separation between the countryside and the city has already taken place under capital. In this case, in a precise form. The abolition of the separation takes the form of the integration of agriculture into large-scale industry, of the systematic application of science, notably chemistry, to agricultural production, associated with the generalization of large-scale land ownership, and thus the expropriation of small landowners, which standardize the conditions of industrial production in the cities and of agricultural production in the countryside. Marx thus saw very clearly the unification of town and land by big capitalist industry, and he was able to see it before the invention of nitrogen fertilizers definitively integrated agriculture into fossil capital and made it a form of extractive industry. So it's not so much a question of unifying the countryside and the city, where capitalism would separate and oppose them, but rather of unifying them differently than capitalism does. What brings the city and the countryside together in the capitalist form of their unification is that they come to break together on one as much as the other the links of metabolic exchange with the land. One way of maintaining this link would be, for example, the use of the residues of urban consumption insofar as these residues are of the greatest importance for agriculture and must therefore be returned to the earth to ensure and renew its fertility. But unfortunately, Marx notes in Book 3 of Capital, I quote, "The use of these residues gives rise in a capitalist economy to a colossal waste. In London, for example, they have found nothing better to do with the fertilizer from 4 million men than to use it to stink up at enormous expense the Thames," said Marx. This is a very precise example of the way in which the metabolical exchange between society and the earth is broken under capital, both for the city and the countryside. Production and consumption in the city generate waste which is thrown back into the river and pollutes it instead of being transported to the countryside and used there to maintain and renew the fertility of the soil. It is clear here how urban life is achieved at the expense not only of the countryside, but of the earth itself. Instead of a virtuous circle in which the city produced waste that fertilize the soil and enables the production of the foodstuff the city needs, a vicious circle is set up. Consumption in the city generates waste that does not fertilize the soil but pollutes the river, and the city's production sends chemical fertilizer to the countrysides, the long-term effect of which is devastating for soil fertility. In this vicious circle, the city and the countryside have both broken the metabolic exchange relationship with the earth. It is this break of the society-nature metabolism that in the capitalist regime brings the city and the countryside together in a negative unity that is made against and to the detriment of the earth. I go to the end. How many times? 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Okay. Under these conditions, the perspective is no longer so much that of eliminating the separation between town and land, country, as that of establishing a balanced relationship between town and country on the one hand, and the land or nature on the other. It is a question, as Marx says in Book 3 of Capital, of social man, the associated producers rationally regulating their exchanges with nature, whether the place of their association is the city or the countrysides and fields. When Marx mentions the kinship which initially united agriculture and manufacture at the infantile and undeveloped stage of both, it is to make it clear that this link was broken by the transformation of manufactures into factories, by the development of the capitalist mode of production. The entry into this mode of production is thus marked by the appearance of the very opposition between town and country. But Marx adds, I quote, "These ruptures creates at the same time the material presupposition of a new synthesis at a higher level, the material presuppositions of the association of agriculture and industry on the basis of their own confederation, which they have worked out in opposition to each other." A dialectical solution, typical. In other words, in the time that the initial kinship link is broken, the condition for a higher unity accumulates at the same time. The submission of agriculture to the same process of industrialization that prevails in the cities is eminently part of these conditions. The unity of the countryside and the city is thus being prepared under capitalism, but it is only being prepared and matured there in the negative form of a process which proved to be destructive for both the workers in the city and those in the countrysides, and even more so for what concerns the relationship of the city and the countrysides to nature. But it is precisely the negative and destructive turn that the unification of the countryside and the city under capitalism takes that can lead actors to the idea of a positive unification, which would consist of what Marx calls here the association of the one and the other. Despite their interesting interest, this analysis by Engels and Marx shows a difficulty of critical theorists with the city, which we have seen reappear in the later works by other critical theorists. This difficulty results from the tendency to approach the problems specifically posed by the city within a broader theoretical framework, and sometimes so broad that the city tends to disappear as a specific object of study. This is the case here by Marx with the inclusion of the approach of the city within the framework of an analysis of the breakdown of the metabolism between society and nature. Despite its interest and its particular relevance for us today, this approach probably does not allow for a detailed analysis of the urban forms of life or the types of subjectivity formed by modern urban life, which is comparable to that which Simmel was able to implement. Under these conditions, should we reproach the tradition of social criticism for having diluted the urban question in a larger problematic, even too large, and for having consequently been only slightly able to propose precise and determinate analysis of the modern urban world? The fact that I have to finish with this question says a lot about the ambivalence of critical theory with regard to the city. This ambivalence can certainly be interpreted as part of what Andy Merrifield has called the metropolitan dialectic. But the question remains whether this dialectic is inherent in the modern urban and metropolitan reality as such, or whether it is imported into this reality by the approaches of what the same author has called metro-Marxism. I thank you.
Slyším? To v redu? Okay, thank you, Professor Fischbach. Now, I was given the role of co-referent for today's talk. We are not really that used to this format around here, so it has fallen to me to interpret my role, at least to a certain extent, freely. So my intervention will be maybe not so much a critical response, but more of a spin-off to Professor Fischbach's paper, a variation on the theme, just a couple of other things that can be said about the city. Yes, I will develop two quick observations about the city, and both will start somewhere from your final point about how in Marx's account the city quite quickly disappears as an object of independent analysis because it is subsumed by the broader categories of capital and even metabolism of capital, of so the industrial nature. Well, while reading, I did get the idea while reading your text about some other Marxist texts that might serve as an alternative way to approach the city. And the text I'm referring to is 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. For those, if someone doesn't know, this is Marx's chronicle of events in France between the revolution of 1848, the revolution that ended the French monarchy for good, and then 3 years later, Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, made coup d'etat, which ended this episode of political turmoil. Now, it's not completely obvious that 18 Brumaire is about the city and life in the city in any eminent way. Its subject matter is just the political turmoil in France. In these 3 years, Marx describes the complex interplay of various political fractions that represented different social classes in France. And, of course, because it's France, the majority of action takes place in Paris. But still, we might ask, is this already enough that we can get some more general lesson about the city from this Marx's work? Well, the main reason why I'm bringing this book up is a short passage from the last chapter. In this chapter, historically, we are already now at the end of this volatile political situation. It has been stabilized by the Bonapartist coup, and here Marx, in one passage, Marx sums up the reasons underlying Bonaparte's success. And then suddenly, in this passage, the intrusion of the rural, of the countryside, into what has been, until this point, mainly a story about the city-based politics happens. Marx notes that the main base of support that allowed Bonaparte to take power came from the peasant class. And then he sketches a quick and interesting theory of political preferences or political attitudes of peasant population, which is worthwhile to cite in its entirety, well, slightly abridged. It's quite a long passage. The small-holding peasants form an enormous mass whose members live in similar conditions, but without entering into meaningful relations with each other. Their mode of production isolates them from one another, and instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse. A small holding, the peasant and his family, beside it another small holding, another peasant and another family. A few score of these constitute a village, and a few score of villages constitute a department. Thus, the great mass of French nation is formed by the simple addition of homologous magnitudes, matches potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. Insofar as millions of families live under conditions, this is still Marx, live under conditions of existence that separate their mode of life, their interests, and their culture from those of other classes, and put them in hostile opposition to the latter, they form a class. Insofar as there is merely local interconnection amongst these small-holding peasants, and the identity of their interests forms no community, no national bond, and no political organization among them, they do not constitute a class. They are therefore incapable of asserting their class interest in their own name, whether through parliament or a convention. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Their representative must at the same time appear as their master, as an authority over them, an unlimited governmental power which protects them from the other classes and sends them rain and sunshine from above. The political influence of the smallholding peasants therefore finds its final expression in the executive power which subordinates society to itself. So, what is interesting here is that we have Marx explaining why a certain class that definitely belongs to subordinated classes isn't inclined to revolution or rebellion, but elects to be adequately represented in a conservative and authoritarian leader. And as we could see here, Marx explains this political attitude of the peasantry as a consequence of a spatial organization of its daily economic life. And so this is something that goes against this simplified picture of Marx or Marxism, which is often boiled down to the view that class struggle is in objective interest of exploited classes, and that they will engage in class struggle unless they are prevented by ideology. Because here, the peasantry does not revolt, at least does not revolt in progressive manner. However, the reason is not, strictly speaking, ideology. Even though here the peasants are by no means among the privileged classes, it is their sparse, the isolated conditions of their lives that cause that they are not likely to come up with the transformative social ideas. So it's the spatial organization, not some ideology that prevents them from being progressive. And of course, here the underlying message of Marx is that that the true progressive politics are primarily the thing that belongs in the cities. But it seems to be that at this point, the city is, for Marx, a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for progressive revolutionary politics. Because only in the concentrated conditions of the city, and only due to the fact that the proletariat in the city is already the part of the capitalist machine, only this allows the working class to unite, to achieve a certain level of self-consciousness and to actually act as a single class. So, what's even more interesting is that this point of Marx's thought, we can clearly make a comparison or connection with contemporary political situation. Because probably the defining aspect of contemporary politics is the general atmosphere of crumbling or weakening of traditional political institutions and authorities and emergence of a new populist style of politics. I'm speaking about the last decade mostly. What we have witnessed everywhere in Western democracies is that on the right wing of the political spectrum, the more institutionally established forms of conservative politics cease to be convincing, almost totally. And on the right, the whole political momentum was taken up by various populist projects with pronounced disruptive and even insurrectionary attitude. So it was the left side of the spectrum of politics that was ever more often pushed into the role of the defender of the system against these insurrectionary attacks. So it is the left today that defends the institutions, the abstract rules and regulations. The left is the defender of unpleasant sacrifices and more abstract principle of justice. And it is the populist right that attempts to profit by appealing to the more immediate feelings and concerns and fears of the individual. And we can witness that most clearly in the debates around the corona crisis and handling of the corona crisis, from the necessity of wearing masks to the necessity of vaccination. Today, the left in many ways became the party of order. And I'm not judging or criticizing here, because I don't think it's simply a case of the left, of some kind of treason of the revolution or weakness. I think that the left has good reasons not to abandon completely this moment of abstract universality, and it cannot really afford to go full populist. I mean, there have been examples of left parties choosing a more populist direction, parts of German Die Linke, Italian Cinque Stelle, and also they don't seem to be particularly successful at the moment. So I think there's some deeper underlying problem. I mean, this direction, populist direction, is forbidden, let's say, or close to the left to execute successfully. So, and this realignment of politics has been interpreted even as total inversion of class positions, so that the left has become the political option of the elites, whereas the new populist right listens to concerns of the excluded lower classes. I do not think this is quite the case. I think this is mostly the story that the populist right tries to sell aggressively. I mean, there is still a reason why the populist right is right and not left. It always excludes a big portion of the working class, namely the immigrants, the other, and it always involves quite a good deal of support from the capital or from some elements of the ruling classes. However, and now I return to our topic of the city, certain realignment definitely has happened. Certain sections of lower class, of working classes have been lost to the left, and while this new division kind of crosses the class divisions, it does, I think, quite coincide with the division of urban or rural, or metropole and province, center and periphery. So, okay, I haven't exactly concluded a very rigorous empirical study who votes for whom, but I think we have a lot of, at least anecdotal examples of these oppositions. We have coastal metropolitan America versus flyover states. We have metropolitan London versus the crumbling of Red Wall in northern England in regards to the Brexit. And we had Gilets jaunes in France, which was an important event precisely because the Gilets jaunes rebellion was not captured completely by populist right, well, maybe partially, not really, but it was, of course, clearly opposed to this, to the center, to the liberal establishment, and it came from the province. And we had similar case in Slovenia last autumn, if we remember. Last autumn we still had right-wing, rather populist government that is in long-term standoff with the Ljubljana-based left, but then in the Corona crisis, when the government did adopt some relatively harsh countermeasures, for example, certificate for vaccinations, then another set of rebellions sprang up, sort of a more wilder type that crossed the traditional boundaries and was neither left nor right, but mostly against this, it was politically ambiguous and mostly focused against the Corona countermeasures. So, to sum up, the city does seem to be an important category in contemporary politics. And here, the Marxist analysis of support of Louis Bonaparte that we found in 18 Brumaire can be inspirational, let's say. Because, as we've seen, Marx introduced a spatial dimension into political analysis. It was the spatial conditions of isolation, of dispersion, that determined the political standpoint of peasantry. And they determined it more decisively than their position within class hierarchy. So if we are today dealing with a situation where, again, the political orientation of the people seem to be at odds with their class position, perhaps something similar is going on. So perhaps how people are spatially related to the power is an important factor in formation of their political attitudes. Of course, I'm not saying that the new dissatisfied population that forms the base of populist political projects is exactly like the peasants were in the 19th century, but they're not completely unlike. The new populist movements are, I think, fueled by very similar kind of anxiety and resentment that Marx recognized in support of peasantry for Bonaparte. And of course, this is maybe not that surprising because Bonapartism are often cited as the first example of modern populism. So it really might be the same thing going on. So Marx's analysis gave us insight that the populist support always comes from the outside, as some external intervention, and it has some strong anti-political content. So the structure of populist intervention seems to be that there already has to be some struggle going on, monarchists versus republicans, traditional right versus traditional left, and now a new actor arrives and declares both sides to be bad and the whole ongoing conflict to be illusory, fake, irrelevant, and demands the mandate, popular mandate, to stop it. Drain the swamp, for example. This is the populist attitude. So I would therefore describe the crucial underlying sentiment of the populist politics as a sentiment of resentment for being removed from the center of action. So the feeling that important things are happening and being decided elsewhere. And maybe the distinguishing feature of modern populisms is that it stems more from feeling of exclusion and distance to power, and not so much from direct experience of injustice. So more exclusion than experience of injustice and subjugation. So, and that this perhaps partially explains somewhat paranoid and conservative character of populism. So to sum up, even though it is not the case anymore that it would be the peasants that form the bulk of this spatially dislocated class, it seems that the contemporary capitalism seems to spatially organize the population in a way that enables the same feelings of distance to power or exclusion from the sites of power. Okay. Okay, and now a rather separate thought. A second observation would be about the cities. Okay, yes. I mean, if I return to Marx of Capital instead of, so this account is of course later than the account of 18 Brumaire, and in the way Marx saw it, it was probably something that he superseded it. I mean, the accounting Capital was the more advanced, but the difference, I think, stems from the fact that Capital is written with more far-sighted theoretical goals in mind, so Marx often jumps to conclusions about the long-term tendencies and present them as actuals, and then on the way some possibilities of empirical analysis are lost, and because it's the capital, Das Kapital is happening at a too high level of abstractions. But nonetheless, this disappearance of the distinction between the country and the capital on terms of capital that he describes is a long-term tendency, and perhaps we are witnessing it, some sort of it also right now in recent decades, because I think as we can witness, one tendency about the city that we can witness is a certain dissolution of the distinction between the city and its outside and the countryside, but not in the way that the countryside would disappear, but the city seems to be, in a way, disappearing. Namely, I mean, okay, what I will describe holds maybe for the local area, but I think it's not completely local. I mean, I'm pretty sure that it's quite a general trend, the trend of economic reorganization of the cities, with raising property prices and the relocations of the industry and the commercial spaces on the outskirts of the city, and eventually also people who cannot afford the high property prices in the center. So in that case, in that sense, the city is in crisis, and this disappearing, not in the sense of so the distinction between the city and its outer and its externalities disappearing, not in the sense that that the city would spread itself into some new megalopolis, but more in a the city is disappearing in favor of generalized suburbia. This is the way the distinction between the countryside and the city disappears today. So it seems, perhaps, that the whole idea of the city as this chaotic nexus, as this general crossroads when people's paths crosses, even though they do not have the same purposes. And the city has this place where meetings can happen, this emphatic idea of the city from the, let's say, 19th century. Perhaps this has become too expensive for the capital, too uneconomical for the capital. The main idea that the capital seems to have today about the cities is the touristification. And but doesn't it already show that we already understand the city in the traditional sense to be dead? Because if you are a city planner and think about what should be done to the city, and the only answer that you can come up with is, okay, we should make people look at it and hopefully pay for looking at the city. This already means that that you understand that the city does not have its immediate purpose anymore, because tourists essentially look at ruins, so it's just a level of decay of these ruins that differs. So the touristification it's already approved that the traditional dynamics of the city and its raison d'être has been somewhat very essentially disturbed. And gentrification is the same dynamic, but on another level. Gentrification is this paradoxical movement of selling not the utility of living in the city or particular part of the city, but the aesthetic experience, the idea of living in the certain part, a certain quartier of the city. And and it's paradoxical because it usually it means that you sell the idea, because you sell it, it precisely disappears in the moment of selling. So this authentic mode of city life is destroyed by the very fact that it is being sold to other people, because the property prices go up and it has to disappear. Sorry. Okay. So these are the two thoughts, and these two thoughts are observations that have developed here, that the city-province distinction is the new crucial dividing line in contemporary politics, and that the city is in important aspects disappearing. They might appear contradictory, but I think it is not necessarily so, because as I try to present, the defining political sentiment of the populism is the feeling of exclusion, of distance, of where things are happening. And this center where things are happening doesn't need to actually exist in order for these feelings of exclusion or decentering that enable populism exist. So perhaps it's even easier is if the actual cities disappear and still the people will feel a distance from the center, because of course it will not even exist anymore. So this is my intervention, and I offer it as let's say as a two extended thesis or two extended questions. First for you, they maybe for the room. So to repeat, what do you think about the political function of the city today, and the distinction of the city and its outside? This distinction and the second question would maybe one answer to why there is a certain lack of attention in critical theory to the city. Maybe that one answer would also be that it's in fact something that is disappearing in the city life, so that maybe perhaps there is nothing left, or ever less to grasp. So.
Thank you for this presentation. There is a lot of things, and I agree with the essential of what you said. It's a very good idea to mention the 18 Brumaire of Marx. It's very interesting to the city problem and to the to explain the relationship between countryside and city. You can also read the Civil War in France in the same line. You have also the reflection on the what happens in the city in Paris and the counter-revolution outside Paris. With the support of the Germans and Versailles. And it is the peasants have the same function in 1871 as in 1851. It was exactly the same. It's it's very important to see what Marx says about the peasants in this text. But Napoléon le Petit, pas le Grand, as Victor Hugo said, Napoléon le Petit has two classes, two social classes who support him: the peasants and in the city
the rebel.
The Lumpenproletariat, which was the police. So it complexifies the things. There is also in the middle of the city, there is also people who are totally in the same situation: isolation, dispersion, no organization. You have this by the peasants on the countryside, but you have this in the core of the city, of the big city, by the poor, the poorest. So it's interesting to see that there is two social forces who support Napoleon Bonaparte le Petit, outside the city and direct inside too. But it's very interesting what you have said about, you make the link between these old texts and the political situation today. It's very, very interesting what you have said. And so I think a big part of the problem is always for us today the relationship between the cities, the large cities, and their outside. And you're right. For example, the Gilets jaunes movement in France, it was precisely this the problem. It's a problem of center and periphery. And you have seen the biggest manifestation from the Gilets jaunes in Paris. It was in the very center of the city, in the symbolic center, Arc de Triomphe. It was, so there is a center, but is it really the center today? Yeah. It's a question, I agree, but they think it is. and it is a symbolic one. Arc de Triomphe, c'est Napoléon. Le Grand. So, but you're right, it's and the problem of the city you have is the city, a population, as you said, who votes for the left. At the last election in France, all, not only Paris, but all the big cities, Bordeaux, Marseille, Strasbourg, have all elected left mayors. All of them. Just Toulouse have not done it. But it's the only one for reasons, so it's complicated. But sinon, all the others. But why is it so? I think the problem is that the people who can live in this big city today don't have the conscience anymore that there is external conditions that makes possible to live in the big cities and to have the form of life they do have, with culture, money, public transport, theaters, all of that. There is external conditions for this, and these conditions are outside the city. But they don't have the conscience of that. They are these left people, also these new left people.
Left by accident.
They live as if there were no condition for this form of life. And they are very surprised when they see that there is people who work and make that possible. And these people were the Gilets jaunes, for example. Suddenly you see, we must have those people to make our life possible. Who every morning bring the merchandise in the city, direct in the city, so you have just a few meters to walk to find all what you want. Who makes that possible? Those people who doesn't live in the city, cannot live in the city, who works for nothing, or very few, fast nothing, and they suddenly appears, and the people of the city don't understand what happened, who have then only mépris. I don't know how to say it in English. Reject them and mépris, mépris de classe. For them, they don't have culture, they don't speak very well, they are mal habillés. But that's a problem today for the left. I think I agree with what you say.
You're saying that today the ideology doesn't work in a way that would convince the exploited classes that they are not exploited classes, but it convinces the privileged classes that they are not privileged classes. Or it hides the fact that it doesn't hide the exploitation, it hides the privilege, so to say.
But the left parties must be able to address these people. If they don't do that, then it's normal that the parties of the far right are the only one that are able to address these people. There is no other offer for them than that.
Don't have any further replies? Okay. Perhaps I can open up. I can really see there's a couple of questions. Maybe just one intervention, just a simple question, because I know that there will be a couple of questions regarding that. The state of the state in the argument between the city and the country.
The state.
State. Maybe that's just a general question. And in that regard, because you are expert in Hegel, why is there no category of city in Hegel's philosophy? And in that regard, again, why is Marx so focused on the city in a sense? Because the commune, Paris commune, is in a sense an important theoretical, I would say, implication for him.
The first answer would be that the development of the big modern cities came after Hegel. It's not. Berlin was not a big modern city at the time of Hegel. It was the center of the power of Prussian, but it was not. There were no industry, no workers, nothing at all of that. So it was not the big modern city at this time were London and Paris. London. no, Paris too, but not Berlin. It was province.
I don't completely agree because, I mean, okay, Hegel perhaps doesn't really speak about the city, but the quote from Marx that's about the peasant support for Napoleon, I think it's definitely influenced by Hegel's reflections on peasant class, because it kind of mirrors how Hegel describes the mode of existence in their relation. Hegel says the same thing about the peasantry, that they are inclined to just follow blindly the authoritarian leader the same way as they follow God, because they have this immediate relation. And I think it's quite certain that Marx is here almost quoting basically. So it's there because Hegel has this. Hegel's philosophy is also about the city in the sense that it posits the peasant as its other. It's a stand of reflection on the merchant class. This is where the Hegel addresses the city, I think.
But there is a bourgeois, by Hegel, and the bourgeois, those live in the Burg,
yes.
That is in the city. But the city at this time in Germany, it wasn't industrial cities or towns. There was no industry at this time. It's difficult to imagine that Germany was absolutely not an industrial country at this time. And Marx himself discovers the big city, the big modern city when he comes to Paris, not before, and then Brussels and London, but not in Germany. Köln, where he was a small city, very small city.
Thank you for your talk. I really like the point you made concerning the opposition between city and countryside being abolished in the late development of capitalism, both being colonized, to use Lefebvre's vocabulary, by capitalist production. And I think it has some interesting theoretical consequences for the concept of nature. Let me try to develop this. So, if we have this strict opposition between city and countryside, the story is quite clear. City is conceptualized as some abstract form of life. I'm speaking in terms of capitalist production. City is conceptualized as some abstract form of life, devoid of vivacity, gigantic company. We are walking through chaotic nexus, I like this, Martin's term, of social relations, and so on. And then on the other side, this is on one hand, and then on the other hand, we have a countryside representing some kind of authentic, primordial form of life, where authenticity is still being preserved in comparison to cities, and there is no nature in game, actually. Well, not explicitly. But when this opposition is abolished, we get some kind of really strange re-enchantment of nature, I would say, as a double reaction to this unified opposition you mentioned between city and countryside. I mean, what's this nature? And it's really well used also in terms of political discourse today. Like, what is with this nature? This is not the first nature, not a second nature, but some kind of third nature, strange malfunction of both. And my question would be, well, at least it's the theoretical intuition I have, it's that maybe also this concept of nature blocks this theoretical potential to think countryside and city, of unifying them differently. Maybe it's not, maybe it's nature is also a crucial element in rethinking city. Maybe these two are not excluding each other, but they go hand in hand well together. Thank you. What do you think about it?
Thank you. One thing is sure, so you will not find by Marx the idea that the life in the city is chaotic, corrupted, and the life in the countryside is beautiful, authentic, and so on. And it is not an idea you can find by Marx, I think. Perhaps by other authors, but by Marx, the idea that there is an authentic life in the countrysides. He would, I'm not sure, the text you quote, but
I was just referring, you made this opposition and then you said this is being abolished, and that this is, maybe you
no
just
problem.
make the argument more schematic.
Okay, I understand. But okay, and then the concept of nature itself. What I remark is in those texts of the late Marx, he used very rarely the term of nature. He prefers the term of the earth. It's important. You don't want to speak about nature in general. It's probably for him at this time a metaphysical concept. He doesn't want to use it anymore. He has used it in the past as he was young, in the Parisian manuscripts. For example, you have a theory of nature, of history of nature, of the relationship between nature and human industry. All of that is in the text of the young Marx. But at the end, in the Capital, there is few occurrences of nature. Some, okay, but very few, and. But you will find very often the concept of earth, the earth, the relation to the earth, what we do to the earth, what we do with the resources of the earth, and etc., etc. That's the reason for that. I think he doesn't want anymore to use a metaphysical concept of nature, to be sure that nobody will have the idea that Marx used a metaphysical category such as nature, or have a philosophy of nature and so on. He doesn't have anymore any philosophy of nature, the late Marx. But he has an interest for the earth, and also for the mankind as a natural force. And what the Capital do to the earth, he does also it to us as natural forces. The devastation. Marx said now, use those terms at the end, devastation, ruin. And he said that the Capital ruin, as the Entwüstung in German. It's very hard. Entwüstung. There is after the Entwüstung, you have only a desert. Nothing else. Desert. A desert. The risk is that after the Capital, it remains only a desert. He is conscious of that. The ruin of the earth and of the humanity as natural forces, as living existence, which must have a relation to the earth to stay alive. The question is how to stay alive when the earth is devastated by the Capital. It's a question for the late Marx. It's interesting, I think, for us today. But it has been ignored for a long time because the official socialism was productivist. So he wanted to develop the forces of production. But the late Marx know exactly what it means to the earth to indefinitely develop the forces of production. Where it will come at the end.
very much for your explanations, your talks. I saw there was kind of two different talks, but I will try, surprisingly, to reconnect them. As I understood you, Franck, your position was that there is indeed a problem in critical social theory with the city, because the city gets lost too quickly, gets diluted in a more general problem, and this is the problem about capitalism. And in capitalism, city disappears in a very short time, and we don't know whether we talk about city or about capitalism, usually, quite often. And then you said, Martin, and I found it very illuminating about the, let's say, political implications of spatial organization. And you said that the city is in decline, the city has lost its function. Does the city exist at all in these days? Because if you don't have any other functions that offer it to the tourists, then this is a proof that this is a museum, not a living organism. Even not an organism that would have a function on itself within the city, within the capitalist system, because you have to now find out what to do with the city in order to survive, to sell it to whom? To the tourist, not to those who live. And then I found your reference to 18th Brumaire really, really interesting. Why? Because, and other developments, because you stressed that there was a switch in history. Before, it was the city that was the center of revolution. And the rural side, why? Because they lived in separated form, because they actually didn't meet. They meet one another, but in a very separated, concentrated way that was conservative. And then you went on saying that, well, if cities before, and the cities were revolutionary, the cities were at the left, and so on, and on the contrary, the rural side was conservative and on the right. But now something new appeared. The cities are the siege. They remained the burgs, the fortresses of the left, but the left that is now the country of the party of order, and the party that has lost its connection to the workers. Why? Because the workers don't live anymore in the cities. So you have you have leftist parties that are very strong in the city, which was traditionally so. Only this is not the party of the workers anymore, and it is not a revolutionary party anymore. It is a party of order or redistribution. Those who show contempt from the present order are outside. So, and I think that there might be even an explanation for that. And this is the spatial organization of capitalism. Because before, in the times of Marx, and in the first part of the 20th century, the capitalism was driven by factory organization, which included meeting a large number of workers that could get organized and revolutionary. This is now ceased to exist. The organization of capitalist production, at least here, not in the sweatshops in the East or something like that, has changed, has transformed itself. And now, because they have a different type of spatial organization, because there are no factories, because there are no meeting points that would bring people together necessarily out of itself in an automatic way, there is a tendency to conservatism within the cities. So yes, I mean that the ruralization of the cities, as you said, has something very tight relations, I would say, now with development of the late capitalism that doesn't rely anymore on the factory organization. And it's a strange thing that I think that the city has lost its possibility, its opportunity, its function of being the meeting place. Now, we get in, get out, but we don't stay. Before, the workers were somehow forced to be together, and by being together, to forge strong relations that could prove revolutionary. Now the type of organization of rural world has come to the city. And yes, I agree that this is why there is a question if the city exists, and it's a partly answer to the question why the cities themselves have become conservative, while still pretending to be left parties. This is the new. But if you look at the maps everywhere in Slovenia, this is the center of the radical left. In France, it's Paris. In North Germany, you can by concentration of the votes for the Die Linke and the Greens, you can tell where the city is, etc. And I do think that these things says something about capitalism and about us as well. And in addition of the conceptual confusion that we still live in regarding what is left and what is right. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That is to say, the workers of today, of nowadays, are in the situation of the peasants at the time of Marx.
Yeah,
they live approximately. They live outside the cities. They are isolated and divided, with no organization. So,
basically, doing political organization was easier before because you weren't forced to gather people because they were gathered already. They were gathered in the factories, they were gathered in the cities. And this is why big workers' manifestations took place in the city. But now there is no workers in the city anymore. So the city has become conservative and filled with us.
I'm okay with in Paris, for example, you had the Citroën factories in the middle of the city, and now it's a park where you can use trees, on the border of the Seine. And you had the Renault factories in Boulogne, and now it's the chicest museum of Paris, directly in the ex-Renault factory in Boulogne-Billancourt, where Sartre wanted to make the revolution. That's exactly what you say.
Yes, how to reinvent the city as a meeting place.
The ex-factory is a museum of Pinot.
Sorry, what is the place of the old factory?
Excuse me.
What is now in the place of the old Renault factory?
The Renault factory is a museum, but not for automobiles, for painters. It's a private collection of François Pinault, one of the richest men in France. He presents his personal collection of painters in this museum, which takes place on an island in the middle of the Seine, where the factory was before.
Any other questions? Or comments? They don't need to be questions. Okay, I think we can wrap it up for today. Thank you again, Martin, and thank you, Professor Fischbach.
Thank you.
It has been enlightening from both of you. Thank you, and thank you from the public for coming. And we will be organizing some further lectures and conferences shortly, but let us keep you waiting to see what will happen. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone.